2020 budget request. We welcome Dr. Heather Wilson, Secretary of the Air Force, and General David Goldfein, Chief of the Staff of the Air Force, and thank both of you for your service and all of that. And we're really, we're all saddened by the decision that's been made by Secretary Wilson. Your work has just been great, and maybe it's still time to change your mind. All right. The National Defense directs our nation's military to prepare for the return to great power competition. This means that we must be prepared to deter and, if necessary, defeat potential near-peer adversaries, obviously China and Russia. In order for the Air Force to achieve that goal, it must properly be manned and trained and equipped. Unfortunately, as pointed out by the National Defense Strategy Commission, we are still in a readiness and modernization crisis. At the end of the Obama administration, the Air Force was at a historic low in readiness. Less than 10% of combat squadrons were ready and to deploy, and even less were prepared for the peer fight. We have made progress in rebuilding the readiness, but more needs to be done. A high state of readiness is crucial for our nation to demonstrate peace through strength. While our forces suffered being ill-prepared, our adversaries moved out and recapitalized both their conventional and nuclear forces. So all the time that we were resting, we were coasting, China and Russia were not. And in spite of the previous neglect of our military, our men and women have done outstanding work for our nation, but it's past time for action. You have testified that, quote, our Air Force is too small and too old to do what the nation asks, unquote, and that the Air Force needs to grow to the 386 squadrons, and I agree it needs to grow and modernize. The future of our Air Force readiness and relevance requires both growth and modernization now. Any successful modernization strategy must focus on results and meeting the needs of tomorrow's fight. Fielding relevant technology fast requires discipline in acquisition strategies. It also requires rapid prototyping and experimentation in order to get modern, reliable, and lethal systems into the hands of our warfighters, and doing so on time and within allotted budget. So executing the strategy will require an open and transparent dialogue with Congress all the way. We look forward to working with you to make our shared modernization visions a reality and to ensure the Air Force is a fighting force prepared for the more lethal and dynamic battlefields of the future. Senator Reed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to join you in welcoming Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein to the committee this morning to testify on the plans and programs of the Department of the Air Force in the review of the fiscal year 2020 presidential budget. We are grateful to all the men and women of the Air Force for their professional service and to their families for their continued support. In preparing this budget request, the Air Force faced difficult decisions and balanced the need to modernizing and keep the technological advantage over near-peer competitors and the need to support ongoing operations and sustain today's readiness. This budget request proposes funding increases to address readiness concerns, munition shortfalls, preparing for the future fight, and modernizing our strategic deterrent capability. While each of these issues is important, I'm concerned that the Air Force may not have taken as thorough a review of what programs could be cut, delayed, or made more efficient in order to pay for the proposed increases. So I'm interested in the witness's view on what efforts could be taken to offset current and future costs. In the near term, the Air Force has money in the Disaster Emergency Relief Supplemental they need by May 1st. If the Air Force does not receive the $1.2 billion funds by this date, they will be forced to stop all work at Tyndall Air Force Base, which will in turn delay the return of full base operations. If these funds are delayed past that date, other dire consequences may result, such as halting recovery operations at Offutt Air Force Base, stopping maintenance on some aircraft, and grounding others. I hope we can focus on the potential consequences and move the Disaster Emergency Relief Supplemental forward very, very quickly. In addition, because significant levels of funding are being transferred to build the wall on the southern border, the amount of reprogramming authority will be limited. I remain concerned that the Air Force and other services may run short of headroom in reprogramming authority, which could lead to delays in other shortage areas as we approach the end of the fiscal year. One of the major issues that will be considered in this year's NDAA is the Air Force proposal to buy more F-15 aircraft. For years, the Air Force has adamantly opposed buying any more fourth-generation aircraft. I believe the committee needs to understand this reversal. Any Air Force proposal deserves our careful consideration, but we must consider it against the recent history of abrupt Air Force changes of direction on such programs as A-10, U-2, Global Hawk, Compass Call, C-27 airlift aircraft, and J-STARS. Another area of change is light attack experimentation program, light attack aircraft experimentation program. For the past several years, the Air Force has been conducting experiments with small trainer aircraft that have been modified to include a modest ground attack capability. Some expected these experiments would result in a program that would produce 1 or 2 wings of aircraft for the Air Force. In the FY20 budget request, the Air Force has changed the nature and timing of that effort. The budget request would defer funding for any light attack aircraft until FY22, at which point the Air Force would buy roughly 24 aircraft. The aim of this revised program would be to encourage coalition partners to contribute to the air campaign effort with such aircraft and to provide training support for our partners who wanted to participate in such a program. I ask that the witnesses explain this change in focus and clarify the role of proposed light attack aircraft. In last year's budget request, the Air Force proposed to truncate the program to modernize the Joint Surveillance and Target Attack Radar System, or JSTARS, and to replace it with a combination of other systems, including unmanned systems and overhead sensors. The committee supported the Air Force proposal, and the plan was ultimately adopted in the fiscal year 2019 NDAA. I understand that the Air Force has continued this program in the FY20 budget, and I look forward to receiving an update on the progress. I'm also interested in hearing updates of your continuing efforts to improve the state of Air Force personnel, including progress on improving the shortfalls within the remotely piloted aircraft operator community, and how the Air Force has addressed shortfalls within the larger pilot community in maintenance personnel. The one major issue I have not mentioned is the proposal for a Space Force. I omitted discussion of the Space Force this morning because Chairman Inhofe intends, and I heartily concur, to convene a hearing next Thursday dedicated solely to this issue with Acting Secretary Shanahan, Chairman Dunford, Secretary Wilson, and General Hyten as witnesses. With that in mind, I plan to use the hearing to focus on the issues I've already discussed. Once again, Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein, thank you very much. And Secretary Wilson, thank you for your distinguished service to the nation. You did an extraordinary job. I wish you well at University of Texas, El Paso, Madam President. Thank you.
It does get pretty hot down there. Well, anyway, you two have been here before, you know the drill, and look forward to hearing your opening statement, and your entire statement will be made a part of the record, and we'll start with Secretary Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With my full statement in the record, I'll just summarize a few points and then ask the Chief to add in. The budget proposal that we've put forward for fiscal year 20 is driven by the National Defense Strategy and the 5 priority missions in that strategy. There are 3 things that I think I'd like to highlight from our testimony and what we're trying to do. The first is we're building a more lethal and ready Air Force. The Air Force is more ready for major combat operations today than we were 2 years ago because of the support and the consistent budgets that have been approved by the United States Congress. In the first place, that means more people and getting the right people and getting them trained. 2 years ago, we were 4,000 maintainers short in the United States Air Force. As of December, we are no maintainers short in the active force. Now, that means that our maintainers are young, and now we have to season them and make sure that they're fully capable to do the jobs we're asking them to do. Last year, we stopped the decline in pilots, and we are increasing pilot training in order to close that gap as well. We are building that more lethal and ready force, but we are also building tomorrow's Air Force faster and smarter. The United States Congress gave us new authorities and in order to buy equipment in new ways to meet a rapidly innovating adversary. We cannot win this contest with an acquisition system from the Cold War, and we are taking advantage of the authorities that the Congress has given us. Delegation works when you do it to competent people and then monitor results. We are using the authorities for prototyping and experimentation that you have given us to start bending metal earlier, finding out what really works, and then setting requirements. We are also doing so in a way that is as transparent or more transparent than the traditional acquisition system by giving reports to the Congress on our prototyping and experimentation programs 3 times a year and setting clear guardrails for when we need to report to you even more frequently. The third thing I would say is that we are changing the way in which we engage small business. Many of you were involved and helped us get the word out on our first pitch day, where we took in proposals on some of our hardest problems from over 400 companies, narrowed that down to about 60, whom we invited to a one-day pitch day with our program managers in New York City. 51 companies earned awards on that day. The average time to complete a contract was 15 minutes, and the contract is 1 page long. We have to change the way we engage America's most innovative businesses in order to have them work with us, the United States government. And we're showing the way, or leading the way, on how we can do that. The third thing I would say is that the Air Force we need is larger and different from the Air Force that we have. This committee asked General Goldfein and I last year at this time, we have a new national defense strategy. And one of you asked us, well, you know, you always come up here and defend the budget amount that you've proposed, but what is the Air Force you need to execute the national defense strategy? And we didn't know the answer, and we should know the answer. So you directed us to do a study, which we turned into you in classified form on the 1st of March, that sets out, after almost 8 months of study, what is the Air Force we need to execute the national defense strategy. We have 321 squadrons today, and as the chairman pointed out, our analysis shows that for the 2025-2030 timeframe, we need 386 operational squadrons to accomplish the missions of the national defense strategy at a moderate level of risk. Finally, I would say this: on-time budgets and certainty matters a lot. This Congress gave us that certainty this year. And in the first quarter of this year, when we looked at our first quarter results, we were able to execute about the first quarter of our program. We were able to do new starts and set priorities and manage appropriately. So thank you for that certainty and that on-time budget. I would also say that one of the most difficult things that we are facing as a service right now is the results of 2 catastrophic storms that hit two of our Air Force bases. Tyndall Air Force Base in October, and most recently Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska with flooding. We need the supplemental to recover from those terrible storms at Tyndall and Offutt, and I look forward to working with you all to achieve that end. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. General Goldfein.
Thank you, Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee. It's really an honor once again to represent your Air Force, active Guard, Reserve, civilian airmen who stand the watch and provide top cover for the nation and our joint and allied teammates. This hearing is among the first official forums since Secretary Wilson announced her pending departure from the Air Force. And I want to say publicly, on behalf of all airmen and their families, what an honor it's been to work with her every day to make our Air Force more ready and more lethal. And this budget represents the culmination of our work together to build the Air Force we need to compete, deter, and if deterrence fails, to fight and win. And I want to state for the record that we're a better Air Force because of the leadership and the vision of our Secretary, Dr. Heather Wilson. Thank you, ma'am. Chairman, I went to war for the first time as a young captain flying F-16s out of Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina just days after Saddam Hussein invaded his neighbor in Kuwait. At the time, we had 401 operational squadrons consisting of 945,000 active Guard, Reserve, and civilian airmen and 8,629 aircraft with an average age of 17 years in an Air Force that landed our nation's initial punch. 401 operational squadrons to defeat a middleweight, non-nuclear power who threatened his neighbor and the region, but posed little threat to our homeland and our way of life. Today we have just 312 operational squadrons down from 401. We have 685,000 airmen, down from 945,000. We have 5,314 aircraft, down from over 8,600. And the average age of our aircraft is 28 years. Chairman, we are not the Air Force of Desert Storm. When General McPeak was the Chief of Staff in 1991, he and his fellow Joint Chiefs were focused on supporting a single combatant commander, General Norm Schwarzkopf, the commander of U.S. Central Command. Today, should deterrence fail and we find ourselves defending our nation against a major nuclear power, I expect to get 3 phone calls simultaneously on my red switch phone. First, the geographic combatant commander will request forces to support his operational plan, which will include backfill for any fighters, tankers, and command and control forces he must place on nuclear alert. The next call will be from the U.S. Strategic Command commander, who will tell me how many bombers, tankers, and command and control forces he needs to execute his nuclear deterrence mission, protecting not only our homeland, but also our allies and partners. The third call will come from the commander of U.S. Northern Command and NORAD, who will tell me how many fighters, tankers, ISR, and C-2 aircraft he will need to execute his operational plan to defend the U.S. and Canada. And the Air Force will be required to support these missions simultaneously, not sequentially, while at the same time, shoulder to shoulder with our joint teammates, maintaining a global presence to deter any rogue nation, while simultaneously maintaining campaign pressure against violent extremism. This is the stark difference between fighting a middleweight rogue nation without nuclear weapons versus competing, deterring, and if deterrence fails, fighting and winning a peer fight. It's why Secretary Wilson and I continue to articulate in every forum, the Air Force is too small for what the nation is asking it to do. And it's why we reported to this committee, as the Secretary said in March, that the Air Force we need to execute the National Defense Strategy requires 386 operational squadrons. And it's why the National Defense Strategy Commission, after their research, stated, regardless of where the next conflict occurs or which adversary it features, the Air Force will be at the forefront. With your support of this budget request, we'll continue to rebuild the readiness and lethality of this force, which you supported last year with an on-time appropriation following a damaging sequester and years of budget uncertainty. And for that, we thank you. Chairman, history doesn't always repeat, but it does rhyme now and then. My father fought as a young F-4 pilot in Vietnam, and he and many of his peers stayed in and rebuilt the Air Force his son needed to fight and win in Desert Storm, which was followed by 28 years of continual combat operations, including 10 years of Operations Northern and Southern Watch, air campaigns in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Serbia, and continuing through the past 17 years fighting violent extremism in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and North Africa. Today, my daughter and my nephews are young airmen, and with your continued support, with on-time appropriations, we'll build the Air Force they're going to need to fight and win in this era of great power competition. So on behalf of every airman serving today and their families, I want to thank this committee for your unwavering support. And Secretary Wilson, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank both of you. We'll have a round of 5-minute round. That was a great historic perspective. I appreciate that very much. It's one that a lot of people have forgotten. Now, I know that we're all locked into the NDS and the commission. They've done a great job. We had 2 good hearings here. Everyone believes that we should be following that blueprint that we've established. And while, yeah, we're on the way to recovery right now, we still have problems out there. I mean, if we were to follow the NDS, that would be an increase for this 5-year, for the fit-up of between 3% and 5% increase over inflation And this 750 doesn't do that. We're not quite there. So I think when your discussion, starting with that, is something that we kind of agreed on, you had to give in some areas that probably could have very well produced some risk. General, what would during that process, what things did you kind of either slight or change from what we had thought was going to be a good model and a blueprint to follow?
Yes, sir, and I'm aligned with the chairman who's testified as well to say that 3% allows us to stay even, 5% allows us to improve, modernize in both capability, capacity, readiness. In the trades that we made,
didn't do the 3% even.
that's right. So the challenges that we had, one of the places we didn't take risk was readiness recovery. And so what the Secretary talked about in terms of getting our maintainer shortage to zero and ensuring that we're investing in people, we did not take risk. Where we had to take risk was in some areas of modernization, some areas of procurement, and some areas where we'd like to have bought more to get at that shortfall we have of the aircraft we need to go forward.
Yeah, and Secretary Wilson, someone's got to say this. We're in the middle of a budget thing, and if something should happen that we're not able to do this, and we had to go back, keeping in mind that we went through fiscal year 18 and fiscal year 19 as recovery years, but if fiscal year 20 comes up and we don't do we have to fall back to the BCA and to or a CR. Describe to us what the result of that would be and how this would have impacted what we've already done in fiscal year 18 and 19.
Well, let me give you, with respect to the Budget Control Act and sequester, for the Air Force, that would be about a $29 billion cut. To put that in context, that would be 4 times as large as what happened in sequester the last time. So let me give you what that would look like. Now, sequester is kind of across the board, but what would the magnitude of those choices look like under the Budget Control Act? $29 billion. That would be no F-35s, cut all of the KC-46s, stop the B-21 program, no ground-based strategic deterrent, no research, development, test, and evaluation for any space system, most of the 4th and 5th generation modifications, and all of science and technology. Or $29 billion means all of weapon system sustainment, all flying hours, all base operations and airfield support, and all munitions together make $29 billion. I think you can see that that would be absolutely devastating in scope and scale. With respect to a continuing resolution, what that would mean is we've got 16 new military construction projects that wouldn't start, and 18 for current missions, military construction that wouldn't start. And we've got 89 research, development, test, and evaluation new starts in this budget that wouldn't start. So either of those would set us back significantly. Sequester at this point would be 4 times as bad as it was in the previous time that the Air Force went through it, and we are still recovering from a sequester that would be just 1/4 of the impact if we had to go through it again.
That's a frightening scenario, but I would agree with that. And you think about the progress that we made during that period of time, the 2 fiscal years. You had mentioned the Tyndall and the OFIT, and we do know that there are some problems. And one of the things that has been discussed is cutting the 18,000 flight hours. You know, we went through that once before. And that turned out to be a disaster, and we changed our situation there. Does that look like one of the things that you think we might have to do in order to come up with the results that we're looking for?
Mr. Chairman, with respect to Tyndall, last week I had to hold back money for 61 facility modernization projects in 18 states because we're cash flowing the damage to Tyndall. And just this year, the impact will be about $750 million. As we get further into this year, my options narrow further and further. If we get into May, we're probably going to have to stop the recovery at Tyndall, and that means an impact to flight operations there as well as to people who are going to continue to live and work in degraded facilities. We're going to have to, in May, sometimes stop a lot of aircraft repairs. We're going to have to ground some of our bombers if we don't get the supplemental to recover from Tyndall. If we get towards the end of the year and we've only got a month or so left, there's very few options that we have. So I'm trying to minimize the impact and give the Congress enough time to pass a supplemental. That if I get into that last month and I still haven't balanced because of the impact of the storm and we don't have a supplemental, yes, it will impact flying hours.
Yeah, well, my time's expired, but for the record, I'm going to ask a question as to where we are right now when we're talking about 48 F-35s and 8 F-15s. I mean, it seems to me we're getting back into the fourth generation that we're hoping to be out of, and then we remember so much, and sometimes in history we forget about the fact that what happened to our F-22s. It started out that was going to be 750, ended up being, what, 187, and we paid dearly for that ever since then. That was a huge mistake, should not have happened. So I'll be asking those questions for the record, Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So I'm interested in those topics too, Mr. Chairman, since I raised it in my opening statement.
You did.
General Goldfein, for years, the Air Force has declined to request funding for F-15s or F-16s, and it was a pretty strong declination. This year, there are 8 F-15s in the budget, $1.1 billion over the FIDIP, $7.9 billion for about 80 F-15s. Could you just give us an idea, and I think it touches upon the Chairman's question too, based on your personal professional judgment, is this a wise acquisition?
So this is what went into the decision, and it starts with Chairman Inhofe, your point. If you go back to the decision when we cut the F-22, a part of that decision was the program of record, we should have 1,100 F-35s today. We have less than 300. The F-15Cs were supposed to be long gone. So first and foremost, as we went into looking at the capacity challenges we're facing right now, we're absolutely adamant that the F-35 program, the program of record that we have, stays absolutely on track, and that we don't take a dime out of the F-35, because it's not only a game changer for us, it's the quarterback of the penetrating joint team. So what you'll see in our budget is not only maintaining the F-35 program, but we're actually adding $1.8 billion to the F-35 program to make sure we stayed on track. Here's the challenge we faced. We have the capacity, those missions, those phone calls that I'm going to get, I laid out in my opening statement that are simultaneous. Our mission assessments of the Air Force we need says that we need all of the capacity of both 5th and 4th gen. We've got 4 4th gen aircraft that have got to fly into the 2030s, the F-15C, the F-15E, the F-16, and the A-10. One of them is not going to make it, and that's the F-15C. So knowing that, we had to find a way to refresh the F-15C line only by keeping the F-35 program on track, and we only looked at one option, which was a F-15 variant to replace an F-15, because what that does is allows you to use the same hangars, same construction, same base, same operating equipment, which is 90% common, same maintainers, same operators, and no time and minimal costs to make a transition. The Saudis and the Qataris have kept that line open and have invested in making it a much better airplane. So we can capture all of that, the business case for being able to refresh that F-15C line only on top of the F-15 with the other 4th gen airplanes made the most sense to us, and using the CAPE estimates. We are now an Air Force of about 20% 5th gen, 80% 4th gen. By 2040, our target is to reverse those numbers, 80% 5th gen, 20% 4th gen. That target has not changed, and we have not changed our position on the F-35. We've just got a capacity near-term issue we've got to solve.
Thank you. Just a quick almost footnote on the F-35. One of the issues you're still dealing with is sustainment costs, which are much higher than you can manage, frankly, going forward. And I presume both you and the Secretary are committed to getting those sustainment costs down dramatically. Is that fair?
Sir, we are committed to that, and we've made that very clear to the contractor as the largest customer. I believe we speak not only on our behalf of the Air Force, but also on behalf of our Navy and Marine Corps teammates. and all of the international air chiefs and the international partners who are in the F-35. And so the target that we put out is to get a procurement cost below $80 million and an average cost per flying hour of less than $30,000 per flying hour, which puts it comparable to the high end of a fourth gen.
Right.
If we can hit those targets, then we've got an affordable airplane that is already a game changer.
Thank you very much. And Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein, last year's NDAA Section 335 asked for the list of 10 most vulnerable installations to weather challenges, and we have not yet received that list from the Air Force. We had the Army here last week. They committed their leadership to send us this list. Would you do that? Because, you know, looking at Tyndall, looking at some of these other bases, it's not a one-off experience. You know, we're going to have more storm damages, and if we don't know where to start putting our mitigation funding and our sustainability funding, we'll misspend resources. Can you send us those lists?
Yes, sir, we will.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Secretary. One of the other issues that came up last week when we speak to the Army is they did a deep dive. They looked at where they could save money to pay for, which we understand are significant challenges. We're trying to help, but as the chairman and the dialogue here is presented, you know, we're not up at that 5% level. We're probably hovering close to the 3%. So some of these savings have to be found internally. Can you give us just a quick sense of what you've done and what you propose to do?
Thank you, Senator. The Air Force also conducted what we called a zero-based review of our 1,072 programs in the Air Force, and we will do that again for fiscal year 21. Our approach was to come up with a balanced budget that made us as lethal as we possibly could be. We restructured our Next Generation Air Dominance program. Of course, last year we had proposed and you all approved the restructuring, cancellation of JSTARS and moving to advanced battle management. We terminated the B2 high-frequency program. We put money into readiness and tried to focus that on the squadrons where it made the most difference, what we call our pacing units. So we also, when we try to do acquisition faster and smarter, we're trying to bring more competition into our procurements because that drives down cost. In fact, with the 4 major procurements that we've announced in the last 7 months, we came in $15 billion below the independent cost estimate, and we're able to take that $15 billion and roll it back into greater readiness and lethality. So our approaches have been slightly different than the way the Army has approached the problem set, but the intent is the same, to get the most value we can out of every dollar that we spend.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary and General, I'd like to thank you both for making visits to Offutt Air Force Base after the flooding that we saw hit Nebraska a couple of weeks ago. And Madam Secretary, it was a pleasure to be able to have you at office when we were able to survey the damage together there. I thank you for your commitment to rebuild Offutt, and I look forward to working with you on that task. I have no doubt that this committee appreciates the essential value of that installation, and I do think it's important that this committee also understands the full impact to Offutt and what will happen if we do not provide supplemental funding. You mentioned the effects of sequester, a CR, if we do not get the supplemental funding to Tyndall, with looking at the 61 projects that are out there in 18 states, and the effect that has not just on repairs but on readiness. But now you add Offutt into that mix as well. Can you explain the effect that will have if we do not get this supplemental funding done?
Senator, let me talk a little bit about that. We have a rough estimate now of what it's going to do, what we're going to need to just recover from the damage done at Offutt. So it wasn't just that a third of the runway was covered by water. It is that the water came up into a number of our facilities and buildings there, including some satellite facilities and other things. I would say two things first. One is a real thank you to the people in Nebraska. When the base put the call out for needing people to help with sandbags to protect the base, the city of Bellevue showed up with dump trucks worth of sand. It was a wonderful partnership, even when they were also threatened. The second thing that I would say is that Stratcom headquarters was in the middle of an exercise when that flood hit, and they didn't miss a beat because there was redundancy in power, and we worked with the commercial power provider to make sure that power was shut off in an orderly way and shifted to the backup systems. Resilience does matter. The reality is, though, that we're going to probably have $350 million worth of damages there at Offutt just this year, and that's not including Milcon, which will be further out to recover and rebuild some of those facilities. And if we don't get the supplemental to recover from the storm damage, in July, we're going to have to start deferring Offutt recovery other than for matters related to health and safety. And that means the risk of mold and continued damage to buildings that then cost more to recover will increase.
Thank you. As you both know, the 55th Wing is also at Offutt. It's the home of the RC-135, which is the Air Force's largest manned ISR platform. Secretary Wilson, last October, you responded to a question that I submitted for the record on the future of the RC-135, and you stated, quote, "The RC-135 family of aircraft will continue to operate through at least 2040 to 2050, end quote. General, yesterday, you were at the SASC hearing, and in testimony when discussing the RC-135, you mentioned that the Air Force is looking at fusing capabilities that are platform-centric. Can you explain, or can you expand on this and what it really means for the C-135 family of aircraft? I think there might have been a little confusion yesterday on that.
Yes, ma'am. First of all, let me reinforce the Secretary's testimony that, in fact, the RC-135, which is not only a U.S. platform, but one that we also do with our UK partners, who are partners in that program. So our ability to fly that airplane into the 2040s is going to be absolutely essential. The Advanced Battle Management System, the debate that we had last year that this committee supported, is bigger than Joint STARS. This is about the future of joint warfighting and how we move from a platform-centric approach to a network-centric approach. And the visual I would offer you, sometimes we, I think, are guilty of putting forth PowerPoint slides that have big red domes over countries that, as though we cannot penetrate or get in. A better visual actually is a block of Swiss cheese, because that's about what any country can put over the top of them to defend themselves. And it's our job to actually know where the holes are and get in. And once we get in, that we do what I call the 5 Ps of air superiority, right? We got to penetrate, we got to persist when we're inside there, we got to protect what's in there, not only on the ground, in the air, at sea. We got to proliferate, and we've got to be able to punish by holding targets at risk. So if an adversary actually ever sees an F-35, which is unlikely, I would like to also send them a message on their screensavers that says, "We're here." Not "I'm here," but "we're here." Because the visual I would offer you is that if the F-35 is inside, it is the quarterback of a penetrating joint team. And that joint team consists of an F-35, a B-21, an RQ-170, an X-37 in space, low Earth orbiting satellites, a penetrating attack submarine, a small team on the ground. And the key for that penetrating team to operate is to connect every sensor to every shooter, and that's advanced battle management. And so this is bigger than the Joint STARS. This is about the future of joint warfighting and how the entire department is shifting to networked warfare of the future.
And as we move to that future, though, the 135s definitely have a role to play. as the Secretary said, through 2040 to 2050, because that future is not where we are at the present. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, ma'am. And where I would give you in the visual is every sensor to every shooter, and the RC-135 is a critical sensor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. Let me add my voice, Madam Secretary, for your service, and I want to particularly thank you for the time that you spent with me over the last 15 months as I joined this body, and it's been very, very helpful. And in one of our meetings, in particular, we talked about the Air Force's Junior ROTC program. That program really came to my attention through a similar program that the Air Guard in Alabama has. Colonel Sparrow, Swapper Sparrow, has a program to give some scholarships for kids. And I noticed that for the Air Force to grow from like 312 operational squadrons to 386, we're going to need like 1,480 pilots for FY20. I am hopeful that in doing that, we can also increase the number of female and minority pilots, which I think is really that Junior ROTC program is directed to. And I'd like for you to just talk about that program for a minute and talk about the success for that program. We have introduced a bill recently to kind of expand that across the other branches of the services. So I think it's a good opportunity for you to talk about the Air Force's success in that program.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thanks for the opportunity. We are facing a national shortage of aircrew and pilots. And while we are having plenty of people volunteer to go through training with us, and we don't think we'll have the trouble getting to the 1480, we need to inspire the next generation of aviators and cause people to choose to fly. When we look at who we don't have volunteering in the Air Force and who's not stepping up in civil aviation as well, there is a disproportionately low number of women and minorities who choose to fly. And when we looked at the data, one of the things that was interesting was that if you ask an Anglo boy, when did you decide to learn to fly? They usually say 4th, 5th grade, somewhere around there. If you ask girls, women, or minorities, it's much more common for them to say in high school or in college. One of the things we looked at was a Junior ROTC program, and here's an interesting factoid that I didn't know before I became secretary. But our Junior ROTC programs, which we have in high schools across America, are 58% minority. And so last summer, with some of our excess funds, we decided to sponsor 170 high school kids to get their private pilot's license. We partnered with 7 universities around the country. They had to be in Junior ROTC, which gave us so we're going after the population we were interested in. So they showed some interest in the military. There was no requirement to join the military, but a full ride scholarship on a college campus for 7 weeks in the summer to get their private pilot's license. So we're trying to inspire the next generation of aviators. About 90% of them were successful in getting that private pilot's license, and we hope that we have sparked a dream.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, and I hope we can get that going across the other agencies. And following up on that a little bit, just general about recruiting. We've heard the challenges sometimes of recruiting, but I noticed, in the budget, the Air Force has increased its recruiting goal without really talking about challenges. Have you experienced challenges? It seems that to meet the budget, you are trying to recruit 4,400 new airmen. What experience have you challenges? But more importantly, what are some of the Air Force's successful recruiting strategies?
Thanks, Senator. We have met our recruiting goals, but I'll tell you what's been interesting is there's a tradition at the recruiting squadron when they meet their quota, they ring a bell, and normally through most of the year they ring the bell about the middle of the month. What we're seeing is that they're often ringing the bell on the last day or 2 days because it's becoming harder and harder, and this is a challenge across. This has to do with 29% of America's youth that's physically and capable of serving, and we're all fishing in that same pool. So it's a challenge for all services. We're happy to report that to date we've been able to meet our recruiting goals. When we looked at the growth and the glide slope that we could sustain in terms of increasing our numbers, 4,400 a year plus then about 3,000 or so after that allows us to have a very steady growth path that allows us to not only go out and recruit what we need, but also bring them in. We have the right numbers in basic military training, the right numbers in tech school, so the entire pipeline now has been built to be able to sustain that growth over time. Probably the biggest success story, I will tell you, is in our special warfare business. We stood up a new recruiting squadron to going after our special operators, our young men and women who are that are capable of probably the most intense training pipeline of any of the services, certainly in ours, 2 years pipeline. And we're seeing a lot of success with mentors, a preparatory program, and getting out to high schools and talking about what an Air Force does on the ground.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to talking about SpaceCom next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein, for your testimony today. I know you spoke a little bit earlier about what would happen if the Air Force returned to sequester-level budgets. Let's hope that doesn't happen. It usually hasn't happened since 2013. But General Goldfein, I'd like you to address what would happen under an alternative scenario that some people in Congress are talking about. Let's suppose you got a full-year continuing resolution. So Congress couldn't reach an agreement to lift the budget caps and pass the normal annual spending bills the way we have the last 2 years. So Congress throws up its hands sometimes later this summer or early fall and says, you know what, we're just going to have a full-year continuing resolution for all of fiscal year 2020. You'll get exactly what you got last year. What would that impact be?
Thanks, sir. I'll just give you a few examples of what that would mean for us because, of course, a year-long CR we would assume would be to execute with no new starts at the 19 levels. So new mission MILCON, KC-46, F-35, TX would all stop. That would affect about 16 projects that would stop and therefore stop our ability to bed down because you have to have the infrastructure to bed down the weapon systems. We have about 18 current mission MILCON projects that would cease and stop, that would affect our readiness. Any procurement, RDT&E new starts would stop. That would affect over 89 programs in the United States Air Force, for an Air Force that's working hard to modernize, that this committee has supported. And if it goes anything more than 6 months, it would put our in-strike growth at risk because we will not be able to bring on the additional airmen we need, not to have mission growth, but actually to fill our formations to do the missions that we're already doing. So it would have a significantly negative impact.
So almost the worst thing imaginable.
Yes, sir.
Sequester would be the worst thing, but it's hard to imagine we would go back to the actual sequester levels. But a proposal that's being batted around to have a full-year continuing resolution, almost the worst thing imaginable.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you for that. A couple NDAAs ago, the Congress directed the Air Force to begin to transition a significant number of UAV pilots to enlisted ranks, an issue on which I've worked, and Senator King and Senator Jones and I are working together on this pilot issue. Could you tell us how that's going, what we've learned from it?
Sure, no surprises. As you might imagine, what we learned is our enlisted force can do anything we ask them to do. And the enlisted members who have been in the, we put them in the RQ4, the Global Hawk program, and they perform brilliantly. We've now expanded the discussion, though, because as we work through in space and look at building the force we need to fight and win in a contested environment, today all constellations are being flown by our young enlisted force. We have 7 members right now who are on duty who are running GPS for the globe right now at Schriever Air Force Base. So the question we're asking is, what is the future of the enlisted operator when you look at space transitioning to a contested domain and high-altitude ISR going forward? And is there a broader discussion that we're having about that enlisted operator in high-altitude ISR when it's above the atmosphere and below the atmosphere? And is there a career path where someone can now go into the business of ISR as an enlisted operator and transition between the two? So we're taking the lessons we learned from where we are today and now expanding that discussion, and that's where I think we're going to land.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to talk about the B-21 budget request. I have occasional hearings on the B-21 and its progress in a closed setting, so we can ensure that 20 years from now, people don't look back on some of the decisions made now as we do look back on the F-35. Last year, the budget request was $2.3 billion. This year, it's $3 billion. Secretary Wilson, in this setting, could you tell us a little bit more about why we've seen that increase and what the department plans to do with it?
Senator, we're moving forward with the research, development, test, and evaluation of this new aircraft. We had the critical design review it was late last year, fourth quarter last year, and the program is on track and on schedule.
Okay, General Goldfein, anything to add?
No, sir, same.
I know we're projected at 100 minimum aircraft. Given the threat environment we face and the posture review that you've undertaken, can you envision a scenario in where we need to have more than 100 B-21s?
I can, sir, and not surprisingly, when we did our analysis of the Air Force we need, which was over 2,000 computer iterations of different force elements against the latest combatant commander O-plans, operational plans, and the projection of the threat in the 25 to 2030 timeframe, no surprise that long-range aviation was in the shortest supply and in the greatest demand. So tankers, bombers, long-range ISR and command and control, those are where you're seeing the largest amount of growth required for the Air Force we need. So I do see an environment where the bombers would be a larger number required.
And over the long run, that would produce a lower average unit cost, I would assume, right?
It would.
Okay. Thank you both for your testimony. Secretary Wilson, thank you for your service. We're sorry to see you leave. I guess, though, congratulations is in order to see you leave Washington.
I was released early for good behavior.
Very well. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here, and also thank you for your service. General Goldfein, you stated that F-35 is the quarterback of our fighter aircraft, and you also said that by 2040 you want a 80-20% dominance of the air wing by the fifth-generation fighters like the F-35. And in all my time on House Armed Services Committee, we had a lot of discussion about the need to invest in more fifth-generation into our current fleet, but then also to start investing in sixth-generation aircraft, certainly because our competitors on a global scale, the Chinese, are pushing into the sixth generation themselves. So I'm a little bit confused. How will funding the F-15X, EX, affect your goal of this dominance, given that a sustained defense budget is not guaranteed moving into the future?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So first, I'll say that the F-35, as I describe it, is the quarterback of more than the fighter force. It's the quarterback of the penetrating joint team. And when you look at the investment that we are making in this budget in penetrating capability, you'll see $135 billion of investment. But that is F-35 plus B-21 plus other capabilities plus space capabilities that all are required to penetrate enemy airspace and be able to watch the enemy. So first and foremost, the F-35, which is why we are not backing an inch off of our program of record and maintaining the F-35, because it is the quarterback of the joint team that we need. The challenge we face is a near-term challenge. Our analysis indicated that to be able to drive aircraft age to a manageable level and to be able to do the missions that we require, we have to procure 72 aircraft a year to do that. There's 4 aircraft that we have to fly in the fourth generation capacity-wise into the 2030s, and that's the F-15C, the A-10, the F-15E, and the F-16. 3 are going to be capable of flying into the 2030s. 1 is not going to make it. So the F-15 refresh is only to give us the capacity we need as we make that transition from 2080 to 80-20. And we find ourselves in this position again because, as the chairman mentioned, when the decision to cancel the F-22 occurred, we're supposed to have 1,100 F-35s right now. We have less than 300. So we're faced with the situation we have right now, and as the Secretary and I looked at the cost estimates, an F-15 refresh using the investments that the Saudis and the Qataris have put in that line to replace the F-15C, as long as we don't impact the F-35 line, was a reasonable choice.
So you're refreshing the Charlie model F-15s, and they're going into the EX. And then what's the projected lifespan for the refresh model into the future? You're saying into 2030?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, longer. The model of the EX model has got a 20,000-hour service life expectancy.
And will that affect what your future requests are going to be for the number of F-35s?
Ma'am, if if we ever get to a point where we are trading F-35s for F-15s, let me tell you, that's a bad choice. The F-15 is not an F-35. It will never be an F-35. We are just, in the flying business, we describe things as runway behind us and runway ahead of us. The decision that was made on the F-22 to put us in the place we're in is runway behind us. I can't affect that. The Secretary and I can only affect runway ahead of us. And what we need is the capacity. And we've got to get to 72 aircraft a year. And we've got to look at the cost projections to be able to make it an affordable decision going forward.
Understood. Also, airspace above, altitude above you and gas on the ground behind you, right? Last year, it was reported that more than 126 military installations or sites and their surrounding communities rely on wells or groundwater sources that contain dangerous levels of two chemical compounds that are tied to birth defects and certain cancers, known as PFAS and PFOS. Secretary Wilson, how many Air Force military installations may be threatened by dangerous levels of PFAS and PFOS? Do you know?
Ma'am, we have done 110 detailed site inspections. We have looked at 297 total locations. So we've done the detail of those. Of the ones we did, so we did an initial look, and in that initial look, we identified 21 installations where we need to do alternative water supplies. So there is immediately alternative water supplies to make sure that people have safe drinking water. We then go back and do a more detailed site inspection, and we have done 110 detailed site inspections of a total of 189, I think, active facilities. We also do some on locations that were BRAC'd.
What about the ones that are on Air Guard?
That includes active Guard Reserve.
Okay, thank you. You, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Goldfein, Secretary Wilson, first of all, thank you both for your service to our country. Secretary Wilson, we're going to miss you up here, but it sounds as though you've got an opportunity that is clearly something in your future, and you'll do great. I do have a question with regard, for Secretary Wilson, with regard to the DOD submitted budget of $750 billion this year. Why is the Air Force unfunded priority list over $1 billion greater than your FY19 request, despite the top-line growth in the overall DOD budget?
Senator, I'll answer if that's okay, just because the unfunded priority list normally comes from the service chiefs. What you'll see in the unfunded priority list, first of all, it's always those things that didn't make the cut line when we were building our budget, and the intent is always to tell you where we would place money if additional money were available. It's important to note that in the first, and we listed ours in priority order as well in the UPL, the first thing we listed was money for MILCON, and those, and if we were not get a supplemental, we placed in the UPL in 20 money that we would need to recover from the damage done in 19 if we didn't get a supplemental. Important to note that in that money is also adding 3 to 5 additional professionals at 63 bases where we have privatized housing and identified privatized housing issues. Because of that, of course, that issue came up after we had completed our POM. What you'll also see there is in money for defendable space, because we're transitioning from a non-contested domain to a contested domain, and so this accelerates things that we're already doing in the program, but moves them to the left, and you see that. And then you see money in there for aircraft procurement, so that again, if there were additional money left, it gets us to 60 F-35s, which is what we are told from the company they can produce in 19. And it also adds KC-46s, which our Air Force We Need assessment told us long-range aviation is a high priority.
Well, as you both know, we're very pleased with the bed-down determination where Ellsworth Air Force Base will be the first bed-down for the B-21. The community of Rapid City is very pleased, and I can assure you that they are prepared and willing to assist any way possible to make that as workable as possible. But we're very happy with that decision, and we look forward to seeing the B-21 being deployed on time and on target with regard to budget. Based upon the study, the that you've provided us, which is the Air Force we need. The number of required bomber needs to be increased according to your assessment. And I think Senator Cotton talked a little bit about it, but I want to go into this a little bit. We'd originally talked about the 100 B-21s as, first that's what we were looking at in terms of the budgeted items, but really that's the minimum number. But there really is no scenario laid out in which you could get by with just 100. What I'd like to do is to talk about two items. First of all, what is that real number? What is the number that we're really going to need to make this thing work? And second of all, you've got the F-35s coming in, and I agree with you, you've got to get to the right number of F-35s, but that's not an air dominance system. It's not designed to be the F-22. And the F-22 is now, what, closing in on 40 years in age? So you're going to have to be looking at that next-gen air dominance system, that platform. What's the plan? How do you fit in maintaining and moving forward with the required numbers of B-21s that you're going to need and still allow for us to maintain the air dominance necessary with that next new platform or system? How does it fit together?
Sir, I may let the chief talk a little bit about the numbers of bombers, but let me talk a little bit about next generation. Probably within the next couple of weeks, we will be releasing the science and technology strategy for the Air Force. The Air Force does that every 7 to 10 years. But one of the things that we are going to do is go back to what we call vanguard programs, where we use the authorities you've given us to prototype, to experiment, and to rapidly innovate. I think if you look back, there's probably a legitimate criticism of some of our major defense programs where, there are multiple miracles required in a program. That's probably not the way to set yourself up for success. And so rather than looking at a particular platform, our next generation air dominance will identify the technologies that we need to develop and test, and then make decisions along the way on how we will deploy those technologies. And beyond that, I think probably we should go into, I'll talk to you in a classified setting on what we're thinking about.
Sir, and with respect to bombers, the minimum number we need to be able to meet the current operational plans of the combatant commanders is 175. And that's 100 B-21s and 75 B-52s. To be able to keep the B-52 flying in the period of time, and we did a business case analysis to look at the cost of a brand new bomber versus taking the B-52 and re-engineering it and putting new radars in it. And what we found is that the cost alone for a EMP hardened new bomber to be able to bring that level of payload in a standoff capacity is far more significant than the cost of just upgrading it, because it has good bones and can last for a while. So it's 175. That is the minimum number in the Air Force we need. You'll see that that pluses up from a current squadron number of 9 to 14 with additional 5 squadrons. Those 5 squadrons are based on the simultaneous missions and the simultaneous plans that we're going to have to support, be that STRATCOM, NORTHCOM, EUCOM, or PACOM.
But the key was the B-52 was a standoff weapon system.
Absolutely.
Not a penetrating.
Not a penetrator.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Brown. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here today. Let me add my voice to the others on the committee who have said how much we will have appreciated your service, Secretary Wilson, and how much we will miss you. And General Goldfein, we're glad you're staying. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be at the last plane out ceremony for the KC-135 that left the 157th Air Refueling Wing at the former Pease Air Force Base. And I just want to share with you one of the things that commander of that unit, Colonel John Pagoric, said as he was saying goodbye to the plane. He pointed out that for the 3rd year running, that the 157th has flown more sorties and more sorties per KC-135 than any other Guard unit, reserve unit, or active duty unit in the world. So as you can appreciate, and I should point out that the plane that left was the oldest plane in our inventory. And it wasn't through yet. It was built in 1957, and it was going to Arizona. So obviously, we're waiting with great angst for the new tankers to come to Pease. And I know there have been some reports in the news lately indicating that there has been another discovery of foreign debris found in the aircraft, and that there has again been a halt to delivery of the tankers. So I wonder, Secretary Wilson, if you can give us an update on where we are with this and what you expect to happen with Boeing and the production of the tankers.
Senator, the production is going forward. I had the joy of being on the first KC-46 to fly into McConnell, and Senator Inhofe brought the first one into Oklahoma, I believe. We have found some debris on the line. The inspectors found some debris that shouldn't have been there, should have been wiped out of some of the compartments on the KC-46 on the manufacturing line. We have worked with Boeing on a corrective action plan. It will also require greater inspection and attention for quality assurance by both the Air Force and Boeing. But we expect that they will be able to implement those quality improvement plans this month so that we can restart acceptance of the aircraft, and the arrival of the aircraft at Pease will not be affected.
I'm delighted to hear that. And are the issues that were found with the, as I understood it, was the electronics that also had some issues with the plane? Has that been resolved as well?
There were two issues that we accepted the plane with where we had some deficiencies that we had to work through. One of them is going to be fixed at Boeing's expense, and that has to do with the remote vision system. So in the KC-135, as you know, you kind of look out, you lie down and look out the back window.
Right.
In the KC-46, you look at a video screen that has cameras on the back, and there's some distortion of that screen because of the way the cameras are located and so forth. We have reached agreement with Boeing on how that needs to be fixed, and that will be retrofitted into aircraft, all of the aircraft, and added in on the line going forward, and that will be done at their expense. There was one other deficiency that we identified, and that had to do with the stiffness of the boom when refueling an A-10, which is a very light aircraft, and they met the international standards. So that actually will be a change that the Air Force will pay for, and it's a change of an actuator to affect the stiffness of the boom.
Great, thank you for the update. I also should thank you for the responsiveness of the Air Force to the PFAS issues that we've had at Pease, and your support for the study that the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry is doing, the first long-term health impact of PFOA and PFAS that will have been done. So that should provide a lot of information that we can use going forward. Unfortunately, we've also heard from a number of military retirees and their families who believe that exposure to a dozen other known carcinogens at the air base has caused them health impacts, including a number of cancers ranging from prostate to bladder cancer. The National Guard has requested that the Air Force Medical Support Agency conduct a public health study for military personnel and civilian individuals that lived and worked on Pease to determine if there is a higher than expected rate of morbidity and mortality. Can you tell me if that is a possibility and what would need to happen in order for us to be able to get that done?
Senator, I don't, the quick answer is I don't know what would have to happen in order to do that kind of a study, but of course we have no objections to that kind of a study being done.
Well, if there's anything that I can do and anything that we need in terms of the upcoming defense bill, I'm happy to work on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Perdue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your service and outstanding performance in the last 2 years. 2 years ago, when you sat before us, you inherited the smallest and oldest Air Force ever. You reminded us of that. You also called out, Secretary, that your three priorities were readiness, recap, and rationalization. And I want to thank you both for what you've accomplished in the last year and a half on readiness. It's remarkable to see what you've done to bring our force to the current level of readiness. I know we have a lot of work yet to do, but I want to thank you for that. Chief, can you just give us an update? You mentioned it earlier on ABMS. I have two questions for both of you, so I'd appreciate some brevity here. But in June of last year, in 2018, the Air Force announced that Robbins would actually host some of the initial elements of ABMS. And it called, that statement actually said, as a service transition, and I quote, transition to ABMS, the Air Force will fly the E-8CJ Stars fleet in the mid-late 20s. The air and space systems that make up the ABMS network will include a fusion center and associated supporting activities. Can you give us an update on what's happened in the last year, how that's progressing and how it's developing, and how you're managing the gaps from current technology into this model that you're talking about in this environment?
Yes, sir. Thank you. You know, the decision that was made to place Advanced Battle Management System at Robbins was based primarily on the fact that that's where our PhDs of battle management exist. And so we looked first and foremost at that community who understands this business better than any other community. And so they're the doctors of battle management that we need to lead us into the future. There's three increments to this transition. Increment one is focused on taking the current sensors that we have and advancing them and connecting them in ways that they're not currently connected. So one of the first things we did with the money that you authorized us to put is we bought back E3 AWACSs that were planned to retire, and we put money into them to be able to bring in feeds that didn't currently exist, because this is about current. Increment one is current sensors and connecting them together, and that is on track. Increment two is about bringing new sensor capability. Many of those are going to be in space, and bringing that new capability on and connecting them together. And the final increment is to connect it all together. And we've just brought on this year an architect, Mr. Preston Dunlap, to lead us through that. His first stop was to meet the doctors of battle management at Robbins. As a matter of fact, I believe he's still there today. And so we're on track, and I'm really excited that Robbins is going to lead the way.
Thank you, sir. Madam Secretary, in your first testimony here, you talked about China. We just received this RAND report as an update on their views of what's going on. My concern about China was that they were moving out from a defensive posture, evidenced by publishing the Made in China 2025, along with what we've known they've been doing with the BRI, Belt Road Initiative, along with their port loans in Africa and South America. The one that really concerns me is that their Air Force investments and what they're doing right now looks like they've been moving more to a strategic posture, certainly over the next 10 years. So as you talk about what we need in terms of the 386 squadrons and so forth, does that reflect this change in strategy that you see China moving to right now?
We do see rapid innovation in China and a change to their strategic approach to the world from being a largely the old PLA was largely internally focused and focused on internal control. They made a decision to be more of a regional power, and they have words for it. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but there was a very good Defense Intelligence Agency unclassified study recently on this subject as well, on looking outward and developing a military commensurate with their place in the world, I think is kind of the way it was. The J-20, which is in service now in the Chinese Air Force, and they've just flight tested the J-31. So they are moving forward with advanced aircraft, but also advances across the board in other kinds of capabilities, air defense, of course, their surface navy and so forth. So we're seeing modernization across the board and in all domains.
I'd like to say one last thing, Mr. Chairman. The greatest threat that these two people have, certainly General Goldfein as he faces this next year, is I think we're staring down the barrel of a CR September 30th. We have 39 working days left between now and 31 July. If we don't move this up as a priority, there's no way we're going to get defense authorization done, HHS, if we have to combine them, whatever we have to do. This needs to be our committee's top priority right now to make sure that in the remaining few days we have before that, quote, August work period comes up again, that we get this defense budget authorized and appropriated, because we're staring down the barrel of another CR. And after 2 years of not having, the number one thing I've heard from these guys and others that we've met over the last 2 years is that this is the number one threat to getting readiness back and beginning this long haul toward recap. I'll just close. Madam Secretary, thank you for your service. You guys have accomplished great things the last 2 years under your leadership. And as off you go into the wild blue yonder, I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Perdue. Let me assure you that is our intent and that's our commitment, and I'm fully aware of the time remaining. But I'm also fully aware of the fact that we've never had to face a China like this before, or for that reason, also a Russia. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein, thank you. The private companies that were put in charge of managing military housing failed to provide safe and clean homes to military families, but they still managed to make millions of dollars in profits. And the services have fallen short in their oversight responsibilities. Now, many of these families have developed chronic medical conditions from exposure to mold, lead paint, and other hazards. Last week, I asked the Army Chief of Staff, General Milley, whether he believes as a matter of principle that the U.S. government has the responsibility to cover the lifetime costs of treating service members and their families for health problems connected to unsafe military housing. And he said, quote, absolutely yes, end quote. General Goldfein, do you agree with him?
Yes, ma'am.
And Secretary Wilson, do you agree?
Yes, ma'am.
Good. One other quick question. I'm concerned that the southern border deployment is having some negative effects on readiness. General Neller recently wrote a memo to the Secretary of the Navy that listed border deployment among the factors contributing to readiness challenges. General Goldfein, have any training exercises or overseas deployments been canceled or delayed due to units supporting border developments?
No, ma'am.
None.
Not in the Air Force.
None. Okay. I also want to ask another readiness issue facing the Air Force, climate change. The Defense Department's most recent report on climate change discussed the impact of this human-caused problem on our military operations and bases. This report included a statement by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, who said, quote, when I look at climate change, it's in the category of sources of conflicts around the world and things we'd have to respond to. General Goldfein, just a simple yes or no on this one is fine, and then I have some follow-ups. Do you agree with General Dunford?
I do, ma'am. I do think if there's time at the end, I'd like to sort of qualify where I think he was going with that.
Sure. But let me ask, does adapting military bases and other infrastructure to climate change contribute to Air Force readiness?
It does, ma'am. I think what General Dunford was referring to, though, is that, I mean, if you go back, if you take a look at Syria as an example, most don't remember what caused the Syria conflict to start. It started because of a 10-year drought.
Yes, water.
And folks having to move from their family farms into cities where they then were not getting any support, and therefore a civil war began. I think what Chairman Dunford was talking about is that we have to respond militarily very often to the effects of globally of climate change.
Good. So let me ask, do you think it is prudent for the Air Force to incorporate climate change when making strategic decisions, like strategic basing decisions, for example?
Senator, let me take that one. We
Sure.
just published an infrastructure investment strategy, and we also just finished a major piece of work on weather. And maybe the Air Force looks at these things more because weather is such a big impact on us for all of our flying operations every day, and we're the ones responsible for weather forecasting around the globe. The infrastructure strategy looks at resilience and how do we get more out of every dollar that we spend. So there's a number of pieces of that strategy, but the resilience of our bases is very important because we fight from our bases. We don't leave our bases to fight, we fight from our bases. And so their resilience is very important too.
And how would you rate Air Force installations as a whole in terms of their climate resilience?
Senator, it probably varies a lot. I couldn't give you a red, yellow, or green chart on that at this point, but I know that overall we've got significant infrastructure challenges overall from a number of factors.
Well, I see that the Air Force is requesting nearly $5 billion in emergency funds to rebuild Air Force bases in Florida and Nebraska alone that were damaged by natural disasters. So I think it's very important that the Air Force and the other military services continue to incorporate climate change in their planning so that when disaster strikes, the impact on operations is minimal. This clearly is a readiness issue. So thank you for your work on this.
Thank you, Senator Rhodes. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here, and Secretary Wilson for your service. I was also sad when I heard you were moving on, but I can certainly thank you for everything you've done and share the Chair's advice to you that it's still not too late to change your mind. I think I'll start with General Goldfein. It's on the KC 46, and specifically, I know that I believe that Senator Shaheen asked a question earlier. I'm more interested in our current plans and the basing in Seymour Johnson, whether or not that's shifting to the right or what the current status is.
Senator, I think we're going to be fine on the basing. We're not seeing an impact there. We just needed to have Boeing stop, put a corrective action plan in place, get up to the standards that we expect on the manufacturing line, and then get the line moving again. You actually can't fix a manufacturing line while it's stopped. It has to be flowing, but they have to put the corrective actions in place for quality assurance.
I also had a question on the talent marketplace. I think right now almost all the officer assignments are in there. Give me an idea of how that's working and what progress has been made.
Sir, it's working well. As a matter of fact, when I travel and talk to especially young officers, what I hear over and over again is the fact that they want to have a little bit more control over their future, and they want to have a better visibility on what's out there. And not only them, but also hiring officials want to have a better sense of who they can look at for hiring purposes. And so the fact that we're now connecting them for dialogue is pretty powerful. And so initial rollout has been very, very successful, but we're not going to slow down. We're going to continue to listen to the force, squint with our ears, and modify it to make it better.
On a related note, how well are we doing, or what kind of changes have we put in place to address the pilot shortage?
So this year we were successful at stopping the reduction. So it's the first year where we actually haven't had increasing numbers leave. So we see that as
what do you think that could be attributed to?
I think it's a combination of things, sir. I think what I hear over and over, it's a combination of quality of service, quality of life. The financial incentives that Congress has approved, I think, have been very helpful. But it's as much quality of service as it is quality of life. And so I think the combination, we have like 69 different initiatives that we're working on. I don't think there's one silver bullet. Combination of reducing overseas deployments, I think, has helped. Putting more white space on the calendar. We've looked at every one of our exercises and reduced those that aren't value added. And I think that making flying in the United States Air Force as rich an experience as we can make it is going to have the most lasting effect. And that's going to start with inspirational and courageous commanders and senior NCOs. And so where the Secretary and I have focused is on when we select and how we develop these young officers to make sure that when they're in command, they can build a culture that thrives.
Thank you. I share Senator Perdue's concern about where we're headed with respect to a CR. And I see your budget request. I tend to agree and would support and advocate for it. But I believe it's more or less going to be a paper exercise and that we're going to be looking at a CR. So I think one thing that we need from you, Madam Secretary or General Goldfein, is an understanding of the consequences of that, because here is a trajectory to increase readiness capabilities and things that I think are important. I think we also have to understand the consequences of our inaction to go through regular order appropriations, and we'd like to see that so that when those who would resist moving through regular order appropriations understand the consequences of their actions. We need that. You can infer it, but I'd like very specifically to look at things that are going to be affected by that. Secretary Wilson, I mean, we can talk about that now, but I think what I'd prefer to do is go, if you don't get this and you have to deal with the consequences of a CR, what does that look like in the near term and how it could potentially be disruptive to progress that you've made? Secretary Wilson, you have a comment on that?
Senator, there will be 16 new MILCON projects for new missions that wouldn't start. And that means that we can't put those aircraft at those bases. There would be 18 MILCON projects for existing missions that would not go forward, and 89 new starts for programs where we're trying to modernize this force and trying to stay, you know, our adversaries don't have to deal with continuing resolutions or sequester. They keep going. And so there is risk in deciding that we're just going to do a CR.
We need to look at that in terms of the effect that it has on Milcon and then the effect that it has on what we would flesh out after those Milcon projects are complete. And people really need to understand that, because I think we're doing you all a disservice. And we need to make sure that those who oppose going through that process understand the direct consequences of their actions, both in terms of the opportunities in the communities for these projects to move forward, but more important to me, the capabilities and readiness that we're leaving on the table when we talk in every committee about our great power competition and the need to really move forward with these projects. People need to start taking responsibility for holding up what I think is an important regular order process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks both of you for your service. I appreciate it very much, and we're sorry to see you go on, Secretary Wilson, but thank you for what you've done. I've got one last request before you leave, too. I met with Secretary Shanahan on Tuesday to mention him the city of Martinsburg that has still not received their money for PFAS, and he agreed we're going to get on that. So only thing I'm asking, it's less than $5 million, and this little city really needs, it means a lot to them, and they've put the money out already, and they just don't have the resources. So before you depart, if you would check into that, the city of Martinsburg, it's the National Guard base, our Air Base National Guard there in Martinsburg, does a great job, and it would be very much appreciated. The other thing I want to ask for is, you know, right now statute only allows us to tap operations and maintenance, O&M, dollars from the Air National Guard, and that's what I consider to be unfair, considering that they are using the same firefighting foam as the active component uses. So my question would be, do you agree, or will you agree, that we should be able to use Defense Environmental Restoration dollars for the National Guard facilities, the same as the military does?
Senator, whenever I get involved in the Guard issues, there are different colors of money there, and I'm going to have to take that question for the record. Our commitment is to do the cleanup on all of our bases where we've been responsible for this, but I'll have to get back to you on that specific question about which funds can be used for which kinds of projects.
Yeah, I don't know why they would be objectionable, because in NDAA we've tried to do this and got stripped out, and I think every senator has a Guard component that basically needs to be able to use their money the same as the branches use theirs, okay?
Senator, you may well be right. I just don't know.
Okay, I appreciate your, again, that's one other question before you leave, because I know you'll be diligent about that.
Yes, sir.
And I think this is probably, General Goldfein, maybe you can help me on this one. The F-15EX, and I understand the arguments for the necessity of procuring the capabilities. I understand all of that. Where I'm unclear about is the plan, how you're going to integrate that, because I think it's a 4-year phase in. And during that 4-year phase in, even though it's the same aircraft, the components are different. So I'm understanding that we don't have the ability to train or the simulators that it will take to train them and won't be ready in 4 years. How are we going to have our pilots ready and prepared for that to come on board in 4 years and them not having the proper training?
Sir, because the F-15EX is only intended to help us with a short-term capacity shortfall and to replace only the F-15Cs.
How many aircraft, General, are we speaking about?
Right now, we're looking at 80.
80.
That's what we have laid in.
And that's because the 35 is not going to be able to meet the demand.
It's to supplement the F-35 program to make sure, and I said before.
I understand that, and I'm okay with all that. I'm just understanding that as a pilot myself, and you as having as many hours as you have, there's still some simulation time that takes to integrate into that.
It does. The 90% of the architecture, the support equipment for the F-15C is common to the F-15EX. That's one of the reasons. So we're not looking.
You're not concerned about the transition?
No, sir. Matter of fact, that's one of the reasons that we only looked at an F-15 as a replacement.
Well, I trust you on that. Next, my final question is this. This picture here, this shows the J-31 and the F-35. They kind of look similar, I think, if you look at it. They're fairly similar here. I'll pass this around to my colleagues. And I'm not an expert on jet fighters, but they sure do look like someone had some plans. My concern is this. And I understand we have the prime contractor, then it goes from the prime to sub to sub to sub to sub to sub to sub. This didn't happen by accident. They're able to, and I'm understanding they're actually able, the Chinese and Russians and whoever else has been able to get up to speed quicker by being able to access. And maybe it might not be high priorities or high profiles. They're able to get into things that weren't classified and reverse engineer. And we're not holding our subs accountable, and we're not holding the prime accountable to the subs. Do you all see that as a tremendous concern, and how do we change it? And will you work with us to change the procurement process, holding the primes, holding your prime subcontractors totally responsible for the food chain, if you will, and bringing some of these platforms to reality? Madam Secretary?
Senator, very happy to work with you on that. The intelligence threat, particularly from China, is significant, and it's...
But I'm saying it's continued, and for them to have the rapid acceleration, and everybody here is concerned about that, that has to be stopped, and we're not doing anything to stop it. I'm on Cyber Command, I'm concerned about this, so I'm just hoping that you all are in total agreement with this. It needs to be changed. Do you all agree it needs to be changed?
Yes, sir. And I'll tell you that we stood up a cybersecurity task force under the leadership of General Palikowski when she was Air Force Materiel Command. That cybersecurity task force is designed to do just what you're talking about, look at every system and subsystem.
Who's heading that up?
Now it's currently the Commander of Air Force Materiel Command, and if, yeah, thanks, Jill McMurray.
Jill McMurray, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary General, for being here. And thank you, as always, for your exemplary service. Secretary Wilson, I was delighted last week to get the news that Whiteman Air Force Base is slated to be the second location for the B-21 Raider. Of course, I think we ought to be the first location, but we're delighted to be hosting the B-21, and I just want to say for the record how proud I am of the 509th Bomb Wing and the work they've done with the B-2 Spirit over many a year, and we stand ready at Whiteman to receive the B-21 when the time comes. I know Senator Cotton asked you about the schedule and whether we were on schedule in terms of production. Let me ask you, and you testified that we are. Let me ask you just about the budget. I know the target price is about $500 million apiece. Are you confident that we're going to come close to that number? What's it looking like?
Senator, we don't discuss publicly the B-21 program costs, and we actually would be very happy to come and talk to you in detail about where we are, but we are pleased with the management of the program thus far by both the contractor, and we're doing this one a little bit differently. We do this through our Rapid Capabilities Office. It's a small, high-performing team, and they're doing a very good job.
Very good. Thank you. Let me shift gears just slightly and ask you about a number that appears a number of times in your written testimony, the 386 number. Let me ask you about the relative importance of this. The NDS states very clearly that the Joint Force and the Air Force need to focus on improving in our key warfighting scenarios against China and Russia while carrying out operations in the greater Middle East more economically. And I'm wondering, why is purchasing more platforms now better, relatively speaking, than investing in R&D, munitions, base resilience? I mean, can you give me some sense of why 386 is important and how you got there?
Senator, the 386 is a size construct, but it also, the work that we did in this evaluation looked also at different ways of fighting. It is not just more of the same. It's not just about capacity. It also looks at what do we have as a stand-in force? What do we have as a stand-off force? How do we integrate things so that we get more bang for the buck, if you will? And if you think about this, and the chief talked about Desert Storm and having 401 operational squadrons. We're talking about deterring and defeating a near-peer adversary, a safe, secure nuclear deterrent, homeland defense, countering violent extremism, and deterring rogue states, all at the same time with 386 squadrons. They're obviously more capable squadrons, and a different way of fighting. So it's both.
You're satisfied then that this budget advances the NDS priorities, and particularly those on not just capacity, but also capability, lethality, resilience?
I am. You know, there are always more things that we can do, and we're always making trade-offs. But even things like multi-domain operations and the need to connect everything as part of a network and driving those things forward. Our science and technology, early-stage science and technology budget is combined with research, development, test, and evaluation is fairly healthy.
General, do you want to comment on any of this?
So I'll just tell you that by the time Secretary Mattis rolled out the National Defense Strategy, the last version I saw was version 67. I say that because it was very inclusive, typical Secretary Mattis, very inclusive. We had folks that were there, and it allowed Secretary Wilson and I actually to align the 19 budget because we were part of the writing of the National Defense Strategy, and then 20, our guidance to the team and our scoring of our budget inside was alignment with the National Defense Strategy. So that's what this budget submission is all about.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. General Goldfein, I want to ask you a little bit about artificial intelligence. It is going to be critical both on and off the battlefield in the future. And as you know, AI is just not possible without good, high-quality data. And AI is only effective if we have a workforce that really understands how to take care of that data. Do you think that the Air Force is, at this point, adequately able to recruit a workforce that is literate and understands that future?
So I think we're in the beginning stages, really, of and the Secretary, and I maybe turn over to the Secretary because, having a secretary that was formerly a president of a STEM university and understanding how the universities work and how you bring in young people and how you motivate them and you bring them in as interns, I think we've done a lot to make sure that we're an easy place.
Are you extending her work assignment?
Would love to.
Yeah. One other thing, and then I do want to get to you, Secretary. Is there value to thinking about whether there should be someone within the services that just has that responsibility, and maybe this is a good time to pivot to you, Secretary, for making sure that we're recruiting coders and data scientists and the folks that we're going to need as we make this transition into AI. And specifically, I'm curious whether it might be even worth considering a mission occupational specialty for that area to make sure that we do make that transition quickly.
That's actually an interesting idea. And the Air Force, the Navy has been talking, I know, to the committee about a Chief Information Officer position. Yeah. In some ways, the Air Force already has, we've got our Chief Information Officer, our Chief Data Officer, and our Chief Management Officer all in the same, all combined and reporting directly to the Undersecretary of the Air Force. So we've got, organizationally got that. I would say that, that we've got, AI is not just about the data. It's about gathering and directing that data and analyzing it at speed. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, it's about the analysis happening right at the sensor edge and not as you bring it in. So for all of us in the military and in the wider society, we are probably going to see a significant shortage of data scientists and analysts over the next couple of decades, and it's a very high priority.
Secretary, I want to thank you for your service, and specifically, as you know a great deal about what we now call the Space Rapid Capabilities Office and how much that has contributed to our national security with its infrastructure and personnel and acquisition authorities. And I just want to thank both of you really for your work in building secure facilities at Kirtland for Space RCO and enabling that office to really quickly deliver solutions to the military. And I look forward, General, in continuing that progress with you. Secretary, one other thing I want to ask you about is I'm starting to hear from a number of folks, both in and outside the services, who have said that if the U.S. doesn't start to buy the emerging commercial offerings that we're seeing in terms of small satellites, small launch providers, that we could see those things migrate overseas. Is the Air Force being assertive enough in procuring or even just experimenting with some of these smaller commercial capabilities?
I think there's going to be a huge demand for small commercial capabilities globally. The Air Force has funded through DARPA an experiment. It's called Blackjack, and it's looking at a small satellite constellation using commercial satellites. But I will say this, we've done a lot of modeling and simulation. Many of you have participated in a tabletop exercise that we've done about the shift from an uncontested environment to a contested environment. And what is the strategy that makes sense in that environment, and then how do we develop programs to support that strategy? One of the challenges with a proliferated low Earth orbit satellite system, that's where commercial satellites usually live and operate, is it's very close to the Earth. That's great to be able to see things, but it also means that they are vulnerable, and the commercial systems without any defenses on them are also quite vulnerable. So we need to think about not just how expensive they are, but do they survive in a contested domain? And the way I like to put it is, I drive a Subaru. It's I love it. It's less expensive than a tank, but I wouldn't take it into combat. So we need to think about it from a warfighting point of view.
Well, Secretary, I want to thank you again for your service, and I'm out of time here, but before you begin your transition, I would just urge you on the PFAS issue that Senator Manchin brought up, whatever we can do to make these folks who have been so severely impacted by that whole, really through no fault of their own in all of these cases. I would just urge you to give that all the attention you can before you make your transition to El Paso.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks both of you for appearing again. Let me add my congratulations and just tell you I agree with all the accolades you've received today, Secretary Wilson, and I don't think any of them are even a little bit exaggerated, but thank you for your service. And to both of you, thank you for your candor. You have spoken with great clarity, and particularly in differentiating the Air Force we need from the Air Force we can afford. And more importantly, thank you for your candor in answering the what-if questions, the what if the worst, what if we don't get our jobs done as it relates to appropriations. So we need that clarity. Our constituents need to hear that clarity, and I thank you for that. I'm tempted, of course, to ask about plans to modernize two very important aircraft to me, the Global Hawk in Grand Forks and the B-52s. I think we've talked a lot about that. But before we would get to that, I've not heard a lot today about, and I'm very intrigued with and interested in Space Force. And I like the message that is coming out. I think you have $72 million in this budget for the headquarters. But I would ask each of you to maybe elaborate a bit, first of all, on the importance of it as we look at scarcity of resources, and we're talking about a sixth branch. There are lots of people with lots of opinions, and yet this domain seems, well, I think it seems critically important, and I haven't heard anybody, any of the combatant commanders or anybody else, whether related to Space Force or not, say that it's not a good idea. But I just would open the floor to let you explain to us one more time why it's so important, maybe starting with the Secretary.
Senator, we are the best in the world at space, and our adversaries know it. And they are seeking to develop the capability to deny us the use of space in crisis or in war. And in private conversations, as we've received briefings and so on from combatant commanders, not from the Air Force, but from combatant commanders and other services, they understand the importance of space as an enabling capability for everything they're trying to do. We have made significant changes in programs based on threat analysis and strategy in fiscal year 19, which this committee and others in the Congress supported. And we've proposed in FY20 another boost, a 17% increase in our space portfolio in the FY20 budget. So we're making the financial investments. We are also buying those capabilities faster and smarter. And in fact, in the space realm, we set ourselves a goal 10 months ago. And in some ways it was a gimmick, but it got people focused. We wanted to strip 100 years out of Air Force procurement in 12 months. So look at every program, see if we could optimize these, and we're not skimping on any requirements. We're going to buy a tailored suit rather than a suit off the rack. We're currently at 78.5 years taken out of Air Force procurement programs. Of that, 21 came from space alone. So we are moving forward to buy things in space faster and smarter. Our policy is to maintain American dominance in space so that space capabilities are available to the joint force and so that we deter any attack on the United States or our allies. So the organizational change that was put forward in parallel with this budget is actually, it's a change that elevates, that enhances the influence of space and leaders in the Pentagon. And that's in it for the long haul. So I think one of the things that, taken all together, the combatant command, which is being stood up, plus the increases in spending that all of you have supported, and the shift to a strategy in the programs to support it for a contested domain will keep us dominant in space, and that is our job. Chief.
Thanks, ma'am. Yeah, I look at it from a warfighter perspective, and having been the Space Coordinating Authority and component lead for Central Command deployed for 2 years, I've employed space capabilities against an enemy. And so I look at it from a warfighting perspective. And I see, given the situation we're in, and obviously align with the Secretary's statement, the problem statement, that we are the best in the world. We got to do three things simultaneously. First, we have to defend what we have, because it's going to be there for a while, and we all rely on it. From the blue dot on our phone to the indications and warnings of missile launch, I mean, we rely on space capability. So we have to defend what we have. But it's not good enough to just step in the ring and defend and take punches. At some point, you got to be able to punch back. And our adversaries need to know that we can punch back, and it needs to be part of their calculus. So we have to develop offensive capabilities. And the third piece we have to do is develop the force that can fight and win. Because this transition from an uncontested domain to a contested domain requires that force to be developed for the future. So I believe that as we were in a robust debate about how to get out to the President's guidance, we were debating between a separate service, separate department, separate secretary, separate chief, to a MedCorps, JAG-Corps. Where we landed, which is a separate service within the Department of the Air Force, it to me is the most recognizable model from a business of war fighting. Of all the things that we're doing going forward, I would offer the most important act that I would ask this committee to take on this year is to stand up U.S. Space Command with a commander, because in the business of joint war fighting, that aligns how this entire department does business going forward.
Well said. Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to pursue this question of the Space Force, but I understand we're having a full hearing next week, so I'll defer. Put me down as skeptical that an organizational change costing $500 million a year is going to change our capacity. So be prepared to help me through that question, and I look forward to that discussion next week. Secretary Wilson, everybody's praised you today. I plan to do something about it. You better watch the National Defense Bill. I'm thinking of an amendment prohibiting your retirement. So you better have your legislative staff scour that document as it goes forward. You have done a sensational job. And I think a perfect example was a comment you made a few minutes ago about the amount of time you've cut out of the procurement process. That's a big deal. Procurement has two problems historically in the Defense Department. One is money, cost, and the other is time. And you have done something that had needed doing a long time, and I really want to thank you for that. Second general comment, and I understand neither of you had anything to do with this, but I just don't like this OCO for base business. 25% of your budget is OCO, and 3/4 of the OCO is OCO for base, which is a non sequitur. If it's base, it's base. If it's OCO, it's OCO. And again, I realize that this is something that was handed down from other parts of the government, but it's not honest government. It's not honest to the Congress or the people of America. This isn't OCO. Let's get real about what these numbers are. General, the light attack experiment, which is to use existing platforms, try to develop a new counter-violent extremist. I understand the A-10 is, I heard yesterday from people in the maintenance business that they hard to maintain now. They're just wearing out. How's this experiment going? Where does it stand?
Sure. Let me tell you first that light attack, A-10, two completely separate issues here. Light attack is not designed to, nor will it ever replace the A-10, and our intent is to fly the A-10 as one of the 4 weapon systems that we need in the 2030s.
Because we've been hearing for the last 3 or 4 years about getting rid of the A-10. Are we now back to maintaining the A-10?
We are, through the 2030s, the A-10.
Let's move now to the light attack.
So to understand light attack and where we're going, and I will tell you that I can't think of a better example of how we use the authorities you gave us to accelerate our understanding about a particular weapon system. You go back to the National Defense Strategy, the second line of effort is about building allies and partners. That's what the light attack is all about. And the strategy in the National Defense Strategy is to drive violent extremism down to the point where it can be handled inside the borders of governed nations. And this is a global challenge from the Philippines to Nigeria. So the question we asked ourselves was, how do we build a platform sensor weapon combination and an intelligence gathering and a network that will allow more allies and partners to join us in the fight against violent extremism? And so we went out.
So this would be an aircraft that could be utilized by our allies.
Absolutely. That's been the primary focus. It remains our focus. So again, we went out 5 months after I signed an initial declaration of an experiment. When it went out, companies came in. We did an experiment at Holloman Air Force Base. We went on to a second experiment. What you'll see in our budget is money to procure 3 of each kind of airplane that we've been experimenting with. We're going to put a detachment at Nellis, where we do our tactical level training. We're going to put a detachment at Hurlburt, where we do special ops. We're going to invite allies and partners in. And the most exciting part of this experiment that we would not have been able to do without your authorities is we have built a coalition-friendly intelligence gathering and information sharing network that we don't have to tell anybody, no, you can't have this information. And it's platform agnostic. And so by owning these airplanes now as prototypes, we can modify. We're going to bring industry in. We're going to bring allies and partners in. And we're trying to solve the math equation that currently exists in North Africa. 1,000 Americans plus 4,000 French enables 35,000 fighters that are taking on violent extremism across North Africa. This is the air component contribution to the National Defense Strategy to do just that.
And I take it from your comments that you feel like this has been a worthwhile experiment and that we're making some real progress.
Yes, sir. Not only has it been worthwhile, but I will tell you that the companies that have been with us from the beginning have been spectacular. And I think there's no better example I can give you of how we used your intent for these authorities to advance. We're not even 2 years.
You mean you're saying for the record that we did something right?
Yes, sir. And we jumped on it.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but a question for the record. I'm very interested in maintenance levels and readiness levels of aircraft and increasing those levels to, if not duplicate, but approach commercial availabilities. For the record, if you could give me some thoughts on where we are, progress made, perhaps graph where we are. You understand the nature of the question. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. Secretary Wilson, I add my congratulations. I'll tell you who is really nervous right now, the individual running Air Force ROTC at UTEP, because if that program isn't the best performing one in the country, with the former Secretary of the Air Force as president of the university, that person's going to have some splaining to do, I think. So,
sadly, there's only Army ROTC at UTEP. So
okay, good. All right, so they ducked that bullet. Congratulations to you. I just want to pick up first on comments. A number of folks on the other side of the dais here have raised the specter of CR. Folks on this side of the dais aren't talking about CR. The notion that we're heading toward a CR, I hear that from one side. I don't know where that's coming from. We don't want a CR. We want an appropriations bill. And we'll get one. We got a great appropriations deal at the end of 2018 with 2 Republican houses that Republican colleagues here voted for, but then after the president said he didn't like it, folks switched their votes. They voted against it, and we shut the government down for 35 days. And that hurt the military. Didn't hurt the Air Force directly, but the Coast Guard's part of the military, even though it's not part of the DOD, and they weren't getting paid for 35 days. So let's be clear who's talking about CR, who's expressing worry about CR, who's saying we might run into a CR. It's not Democrats. We don't want a CR. We want a budget. And let me just ask, if there is a CR and sequester kicks back in, my understanding is it's not steady state funding. Am I correct that funding would start to ratchet down under a CR if sequester kicks back in?
Senator, if you move to a sequester, the cut for the Air Force would be about $29 billion. And I think you were at another hearing when I was talking about this, but that's 4 times the size of the sequester we had last time the Air Force went through this. And just so the choices, sequester would be across the side of all program elements. But if it were concentrated, the scope of this is it would be all F-35s, all KC-46s, all B-21 stopped, ground-based strategic deterrent, all research, development, test, and procurement of space, and most 4th and 5th generation modifications, all science and technology. You add all of that together, and you get $29 billion in a single year.
Sequester would be foolish. CR would be foolish. There's nobody on this side of the dais who is talking about either. We can do an appropriations bill. Let me move to hurricane relief. I have a publication from the OSD Comptroller, and I just want to make sure this is right. The Air Force hurricane recovery estimate, just the Air Force, is $5 billion, that's my understanding, for Tyndall, Eglin, Warner Robins, Goldsboro, Sumter, and Hampton, VA. Is that $5 billion number accurate, Madam Secretary?
It's 3.7 plus 1.2.
Okay, so $4.9 billion. Now, that's the Air Force number. In the DoD-wide, the hurricane recovery request is $8.9 billion. That's for Hurricanes Michael and Florence. And here's the way that we're proposing to deal with that. The DoD they're trying to cobble together $2.4 billion out of the FY19 budget, and they're flexing cash around to be able to do it. They may need a supplemental of 1.8. They may not be able to find enough, but they're trying to find $2.4 billion in FY19. And the department has in the budget before us, $3 billion for FY20. So that gets to 5.4 out of the 8.9, and that leaves 3.5, 3.6 billion unfunded for hurricane relief. Now, I'm struck when I saw that the unfunded requirement for hurricane relief is $3.6 billion, that is exactly the amount that the President is taking out of the FY19 MELCON budget, $3.6 billion. It's $3.6 billion out of MELCON. It's $2.5 out of the drug interdiction account. So if we were not taking the 3.6 out of MELCON to deal with what your colleagues have testified here as a non-military emergency, that $3.6 billion could be used to fill the unfunded requirements for hurricane relief for the entire DoD. And so I'm just putting that on the record because many of us voted against the declaration a few weeks back because we don't think a non-military emergency should give the President a license to ransack the military's budget. And the numbers dollar for dollar are the same. That $3.6 billion is the amount of the unfunded requirement to do the hurricane relief on Tyndall and on other installations, Lejeune, et cetera, that are outside the Air Force. That's important. General Goldfein, last thing I want to say is this. Military housing, folks have asked you about it. Your statement in that hearing where you said, I've lived in military housing most of my life as a child, as a member of the military, and my wife and my kids have lived in military housing. I think you said 50 years plus in military housing or something like that. And you said that you have never worried for your own health. You've never worried for the health of your spouse. You've never worried for the health of your kids in military housing. And you said that in a very powerful way to point out that people who are in military housing right now shouldn't have to either. And that comment gave me a feeling that there was a command presence here that's going to take this very, very seriously until we get it right. We'll make sure that you do, but I'm given confidence by the way you expressed that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Let me just make one comment here, and we can discuss this in a different setting, perhaps. Just keep in mind that the problem that many on this side of the aisle see is parity. This is the first time in my memory that we've been in a situation, and I'm older than you are, I've been around longer than you have, and I've observed, certainly since World War II, that we have not been in a situation where defending America wasn't the #1 priority. It is no longer as a result of the last administration. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I know there have been questions about the F-35 and the F-15. And as you well know, prior to the release of the President's budget request, my Connecticut colleagues and I sent a letter to Acting Secretary Shanahan expressing concern about the then rumored cuts to the F-35 program. I am deeply disappointed, more so now than then, that these reports prove to be true. Instead of the robust investment in the fifth generation F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, this budget request proposes a mix of fourth and fifth generation fighters. This step seems to be a shift in strategic planning. This shift appears to have been directed by the Secretary, or I should say the Acting Secretary of Defense, not the Air Force. Is that true?
No, sir. The Acting Secretary of Defense did not direct us to do that, or did not direct me to do that.
Was it your initiative?
I'm sorry, sir, I didn't hear you.
Was it your initiative?
Sir, when we put together a budget and make sausage, we put forward ideas, they then go forward to the OSD level and cost analysis and program evaluation, and the comptroller then look at various programs and how all of this works. In the process of that, we did a deep dive, particularly looking at tactical air and how are we going to get to where we need to be without our airframes. We've got some airframes, particularly the F-15C, that's not going to make it there. And you look at the various SAN charts and pieces of analysis and what the combatant commander requirements are, and we cannot meet their requirements in capacity because that F-15C is just not going to live long enough. And so what should we do about that within the money that we have? And the solution that we came up with in concert with CAPE and the comptroller was to buy, we're committed to the F-35, was to buy 48 F-35s, and then instead of trying to extend the life of those F-15Cs, replace them with an F-15E.
What was the initial recommendation, though, that you made before all of the grinders then took over?
Yeah, I can tell you that when what we could do within the money that the way this works, and I didn't know it when I was up here on the Hill, but we basically are given a top line internal to the Air Force and try to build the best program we can to achieve the National Defense Strategy objectives within that top line. That included a proposal for 48 F-35s. With that, we would see a decline in the number of fighter squadrons we would have in the out years because those F-15Cs weren't going to make it. When we went forward and said, what does this mean for our ability to meet combatant commander requirements, the answer was not good. We can't keep declining in the number of fighter squadrons we have. And in cooperation with CAPE and the comptroller, one of the ideas was to replace those dying F-15Cs with an F-15EX off the line. And by doing that, the Qataris and the Saudis have kept the line open and have invested money in modernization there. We wouldn't have any MILCON cost. We could do local training to shift from an F-15C to an F-15E. Most of the ground equipment is the same. Many of the parts are the same. We wouldn't have to retrain the maintainers. So when it's a balance of capacity and capability, given the budget that we have available, that was what made, we thought, the most sense.
So I hate to be simplistic about it. Your initial recommendation, as I understand it, your initial budget that you submitted to the Secretary of Defense did not include the F-15s, and then all of these factors were made aware to you?
Senator, we do the best we can with the top line we're given internally, and that included 48 F-35s and a declining size of the number of fighter squadrons. The question then was, what is the impact of that? When we went forward with the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the CAPE and the comptroller, and they never allocate all the money out when we go through this process, and it was, well, if there were more money available, can we stem that decline in the number of fighter squadrons we have available? And so the first thing was to keep 48 F-35s. We're committed to that platform. It's a game changer. How can we reduce the impact of the loss of the F-15C? And this was the answer we came up with.
Sir, I would just offer that as part of the dialogue, one of the things that the Secretary and I made very clear was that we were not going to take money from the F-35 and put it into an F-15. This is additive F-15, but we absolutely have to keep the F-35 program on track because as the largest customer, we speak not only for the United States Air Force, but also for our teammates in the Navy and the Marine Corps that are buying the F-35 and all of our international teammates, because we need our international allies and partners in the 5th generation with us. To give you an example, we need Canada, who's going through their process right now. We need them. They're part of an alliance that we worked together in NORAD for 60 years. And to defend our homeland together, we need them in the 5th gen. So we're not backing an inch off the F-35 as we go forward.
Well, I take it at word, because my time has expired, that there will be no diminishing of commitment to the F-35, and I think that is certainly the right goal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Let me make one comment about the F-35 that I don't think has been made. Yeah, we have the figure of 1763 that is supposed to be in this time frame. We are now at 182. We should be at 1,100. I think you'd agree with that figure. So that's one of the problems that we have not had a chance to explore, but it's a problem certainly not of your doing. Appreciate very much the great responses that you made to all these questions. We're adjourned.
Thank you.